Without any further introduction, here is Mr. Lyndon LaRouche.
Probably in the course of events. Great. Well, I'm glad to see you all arrived here safely, and we hope you leave safely after what I have to tell you. You know, it's time to get serious. And we have some old fogies. You know what an old fogey is? Somebody over 45 and under 62. Who are rather pessimistic about life, you know, if they don't get instant rewards. It's sort of a case of a mass commitment to ejaculatio precox. It's called a baby boomer. Instant gratification and instant frustration. So that they tend to be pessimistic about our situation. They obviously, most of them are draft dodgers and therefore don't know much about in their careers, and they don't know much about like Cheney. You know, Cheney's a draft dodger. He's 63 years old. He's just 1 year over the official baby boomer age, and he dodged the draft. His wife got pregnant to help him dodge the draft. He was about to be, and she got pregnant. Miracles. She pulled miracles all sides. So. But the problem is this: is we're not in a situation that requires pessimism. The baby boomers tend to be pessimistic if they don't get instant gratification. And therefore they want to say, well, you weren't elected president yesterday, therefore I'm pessimistic. What are we doing all this for? We are now in a situation, you have a presumptive candidate for the Democratic nomination who is currently a global disaster. And not only is he currently a global disaster, he is perceived as a global disaster, even by those who are protecting his candidacy. That is, at this point, it probably is the case, but for what the Democratic Party generally did with respect to me, Cheney would be out already a year ago or so. Possibly even we might not have had an Iraq war. Certainly, if the Democratic Party had not excluded me, we would not have an Iraq war. Couldn't have happened. Because once the debate, the issue, the controversy over the cover-up had occurred, you couldn't go ahead with a war. We had a bunch of gutless people who, in the fall of 2002, capitulated. And if I had been in the picture in the Democratic Party, it wouldn't have happened. They wouldn't have dared. Because some of them were intelligent enough to recognize I was putting a penalty on them all. But they weren't afraid of me in the party because they were fools. I did lay down the grounds for the penalty. But they said we can ignore his threat of a penalty because he's not going to be there to collect on the penalty. Now you've got the point that we have a war in Iraq, which is insupportable. And you have horrors that are going on there. Now, evidence of the horror became manifest in terms of some dirty pictures. And we understand we have not gotten the full edition, which we had promised by Defense Secretary Rumsfeld. He'll give you some more really ugly pictures. The worst is yet to come, he's promised. And considering the people he works with, I wouldn't doubt that. I would expect it. But the policy was already there. You didn't need the pictures to know the policy. You didn't need the pictures to know that that's what was happening in Guantanamo Bay. You didn't need the pictures to know all these arrests and suspensions and roundups, like roundups after the Reichstag fire in Germany. Goering set fire to the Reichstag and they began rounding everybody up they didn't like. Here in the United States, they began rounding up Muslims, just rounding them up and holding them for various periods of time with no civil rights under Ashcroft and similar kinds of things under Bush. So we know this was all going on. There was no mystery. But it went on. It went on and on and on, largely because of the Democratic Party leadership, the Democratic National Committee. It went on because I was excluded from the fight, officially. They thought they had me out of the picture. They didn't feel like themselves accountable to what I was saying about them. Now that has changed. The pictures were simply the trigger, the detonator on the explosive charge, which was already there. And what has helped to make this that is most people who know anything know about my LaRouche doctrine. It is influential throughout the Middle East, so-called. It's spreading around the world. Everyone sophisticated in Washington knows it's there. Our military experts know it's right. And so the pressure's on. Because we have two issues. We have the biggest financial crisis in modern history, which most people know about behind the scenes. They just agreed to pretend, like typical under 62-year-old people, to pretend it isn't there. I don't go there. You can talk about depressions. They come. I will ignore them. They don't exist. It's like the puka, you know, the New Yorker cartoon series, Thurber, the rabbit, the mysterious invisible rabbit, the giant invisible rabbit, the puka. The depression isn't there. It doesn't actually exist. Why? Because we refuse to acknowledge it. It won't come either. Why won't it come? Because we and the Republicans have agreed, the White House have agreed, it will not come until after November, until after the election. It will not come until after the election. We have decided. They have told Europeans, it will not come until after the Depression. We have fixed it. They fixed precisely nothing. It's coming on. So, but under the conditions of continuation of the Cheney policy, conditions of warfare, it would be impossible to carry out anything resembling an effective defense against the onrushing financial economic collapse. It just won't be possible. If you don't have cooperation and trust among nations, I'll take one example, little case in point. Now, in the past week, the price of petroleum on the London Petroleum Marketing Exchange, which sets the price at the end of the day, at the close of doing business, rose to the vicinity of $40 a barrel. And it has not stopped then. A great part of the world's petroleum supplies, on which we have made ourselves like fools excessively dependent by suppressing nuclear development. If we had done in the United States what was done in France even, in terms of percentile of power generation and distribution from nuclear power, we would not have the degree of national insecurity we have on power generation and distribution today. But now in this condition, where the game has been rigged to make the world dependent upon petroleum supplies as a basic fuel stock internationally, and in which the Gulf area is the richest producer of petroleum at the lowest price on the planet. What happens if you have a general outbreak of disruption tantamount to what's going on in Iraq, in the region, the Gulf region? Iraq is one of the major petroleum producers in the world. It's a key part of the complex. North of the Gulf itself, it's the most important producer of cheap petroleum supplies because of natural conditions there. If this entire area begins to go up in smoke, can you afford to drive an automobile in the United States? How many power stations in the United States are dependent upon petroleum burning, or natural gas? How much of the industry of the United States? Look at those trucks careening along the highways because we don't have railroads anymore, at least in most of the country. What happens to all those trucks? What happens to the structure of the physical economic structure of the world, especially Europe and the Americas, under those conditions? Therefore, as long as you keep Southwest Asia a strategic part of this planet, in the condition it's in now, with an increasingly explosive condition fostered by the situation of U.S. policy in Iraq, under the conditions of an already overripe explosion and collapse of the world monetary financial system, what is the strategic interest of the United States and its people in carrying out my doctrine now? People say, what's your chances of being nominated and elected? They said they're probably much better than your chances of surviving my not being elected. That's the way people have to think about it. You do come in the course of history to points of crisis which have been ripening all along, and which you may be like a baby boomer, an under 62er, have been pretending you could ignore. And the crisis comes and you have to make a decision. The decision involves several things. It involves changing what you assume to be is unchangeable. You say, we will never do that. No one will ever accept that. No one will ever do what you say. So what are you talking for? Nobody is ever going to accept what you're going to say. Suddenly you come to the point, well, in other words, you're saying you don't wish to survive. You have to change your values, you have to change your way of thinking, or you are not going to survive. That's what we're at. We're at one of the great points in history, which I've been talking about for a long time. It was coming on. We talked about it. People said, no, it's not going to happen. We're instant gratification people. If it didn't happen yesterday, it will never happen. And it goes on and on and on. And finally, the time comes to pay the bill. I will never pay that bill. That is, to make the changes in policy, the changes in my way of thinking, which you say I have to make. I will never do that. So history will just have to accept the fact that I'm not willing to go along with that. Therefore, you're wrong, because we will never accept that. I'll take the case of the Peloponnesian War. Athens, which had risen to, in the time of Pericles, to a position of unusual degree of strategic power in the region, as being the head of a coalition which had, at least on the maritime side, had defeated the Persian Empire in a rather decisive way. And at that point, on the basis of the spread of an ideology which is virtually identical with what is popular in the United States today, called popular opinion, majority popular opinion, popular tastes. These were the Athenians who said, we are now, like Washington, we are an empire. Our last competitor, the Persian Empire, has collapsed. Sparta has accepted our leadership. We have no competitors. We can now run the world. We are now an empire. And therefore, they went to the small island of Melos and said, well, here are your orders. And the Milesians said, no, you're not treating us properly. Well, you'll do that or we'll kill you. And the Milesians said, we won't do it. So they came and they killed the men and many others. They committed genocide against the population of the small island of Melos. This act fed the arrogance of the Athenians under Pericles. And they went into a general war which became known as the Peloponnesian War. It became a war between certain groups of states in the area aligned with Sparta and also allied with Athens. They weren't satisfied with that. Under Thrasymachus, who was a most notorious character, opponent of Socrates in the Republic, they went into Magna Graecia, that is the southern part of the Greek colonies in Italy and adjoining territories, Sicily and southern Italy. And they extended the war there under Thrasymachus. As a result of that, Greek civilization, politically as such, was doomed. It never recovered from that effect. And despite the aftermath of Alexander the Great, who was influenced while he lived by Plato's Academy of Athens, despite that, this cleared the way for the emergence of the Roman Empire, or Roman conquest and Roman Empire, especially from about 200 BC, at the time the Romans conquered Syracuse and killed Archimedes. There was a turning point down in general trends in European civilization as a whole until the 15th century Renaissance. That is popular opinion for you. It was called then sophistry. Today in US politics, it's called spin. I don't spin the things that way. You say this, I have a different spin. I have my desires. And you're not going to spin me out of my desires. And that's the situation we have. So you have a population, a culture, an opinion, and trends which are clinically insane, like those of the Athenians of the time of Pericles when they started the persecution of the people of Melos. We are doing, in a sense, in Iraq, what the kingdom of Pericles, or leadership of Pericles, did to the people of Melos and other countries. And we're headed toward a similar consequence. Now, as you find, Socrates was subjected to judicial murder by an organization known as the Democratic Party of Athens. The tradition of democracy, the very meaning of democracy today in the United States, the popular understanding of the meaning of the word democracy in the United States and Western Europe is identical to the conception of sophistry practiced by the Athens Pericles. In other words, we are not only in a parallel situation to that which brought the downfall of the leading culture of that period, Athens, we are falling for identically the same reasons. And we call it democracy. We call it popular opinion. We call it public opinion. We say you cannot go against public opinion. You cannot go against the Democratic Party's public opinion within its ranks. You've got to stick to what the newspapers and the mass media accept. This is sophistry. This is moral stupidity. How much moral stupidity can you report upon in your experience? How many people say you can't do it, the mass media won't support you? How many people say you can't do it? Public opinion won't support you. How many people say you can't put the toothpaste back in the tube? We've made the changes and you cannot go back and fill the tube again and go back to what things were before. How many people say that? How many people tell you the system is going to be that way? What are they telling you? If they are right in their forecast of what's going to happen, what is going to happen? The United States will virtually disappear. And the rate of death in the United States and the rate of poverty will be far worse than anything you imagine today. So they have the power, in a sense, to stick to their popular stupidity and to behave the way they've been behaving up to now. But can they outlive the results of that conviction? In other words, they either go our way or this nation is doomed. And it's not doomed because we are so smart. It's doomed because we have chosen a rational alternative, as Socrates and Plato did, to the alternative called democracy in the time that the Democratic Party of Greece, so-called by the Greeks themselves at that time, committed the judicial murder of Socrates in a trial which reminds you of kind of the political trials that occurred in the United States recently. The way the court system functions in recent decades. In other words, you're looking at a nation which tells you that it is doomed. When they tell you this is popular opinion, they're telling you we have decided to die as a nation. And you see it in Iraq. People say, well, how could they do that? What was their interest? There must be a rational reason why they did it. There was no rational reason. There was an obsession, just like Ashcroft's religious obsession, like religious fanatics' obsession. Do you think the Battle of Armageddon is going to mean that God is going to intervene and these guys aren't going to have to pay the rent next month? They believe it. They say they believe it. They get up there. They give these long-winded speeches at these revival meetings, and they promise things exactly like that. Do you believe that any of the things that these preachers say is going to happen? Do these people appear to believe that? They appear to believe it. Fanatically. They appear it with or without delay. And that's the kind of society we live in. So you are in a very interesting period in history. Can you do something to change the course of the United States today, as the Greeks had reason to wish they had changed the policy of Athens back at the beginning of the Peloponnesian War? If we don't make that change now, what will happen to us will be far worse than what happened to the Greeks in the Peloponnesian War. We will destroy ourselves. So therefore, the pessimist is a person among us and around us. We run into are people who say, well, we're not successful. We're not going to be successful because we're going against popular opinion. We're going against the mass media, determined opinion. We're going against authorities who will not support us because we offend them. We're telling them they're behaving like fools. We offend them by behaving like Socrates and telling the truth. And the point is, some of you were younger and you have more juice in you. And therefore you have more guts when it comes to defying a generation which you know as your parents' generation, which you know has made a mess of this nation and of the world. And you know that you have no future under the ideas which are prevalent in your parents' generation. And you've got some juice in you. And therefore you're capable of saying, well, I'm supposed to have a future for at least 50 years from now, or 50 or 60 years from now. What kind of a future is it? Does it even exist? So you have a conflict between what you perceive being young adults in that age group where you have more vim and vigor than the old farts do. They don't have to lack that vim and vigor. They just chose to lack it. They want a sense of security, which is otherwise called stupidity and inactivity, inertia. If I'm not being forced to move, I'm secure. If I can stick to my old habits, I'm secure. If I'm within the bounds of popular opinion, I'm secure. If I dress properly, just you take the case like these Millennials models. You get a girl, and she's been vomiting too much. She's so skinny, you wouldn't see anything except a floating head, unless she were wearing some indescribably ugly rags, torn rags. This is called fashion. People are trying to compete in the United States and elsewhere. Women are trying to compete. Some women who are much too old to do this. As a matter of fact, it's bad for their health. Are trying to do this in order to be popular, to compete in popular fashion. That's what we're dealing with. So therefore, what do? There's only one thing you can do. The thing that Socrates did, and the thing that Plato did. The legacy of that period, of the work of Socrates and Plato and similar people who followed him, which gave us the basis for developing and creating modern European civilization, especially as expressed by the work of Dante. Now, Dante was a loser. Dante Alighieri. He was a loser. He was killed on the way back from Venice. Mysterious death. He was despised. He was pronounced a heretic. His writings were banned by the Vatican, which was a very corrupt Vatican at the time. As a matter of fact, the Vatican collapsed. We had 3 Vaticans, and possibly 4, in the course of a new dark age in the 14th century. 1/3 of the population of Europe was lost. That's what the level of population dropped by 1/3. Half the parishes of Europe vanished from the map in a period of about 30-odd years, the new dark age. Mass insanity, like the Republicans in today, the Republican religious fanatics of today, the single-issue fanatics of today. Mass insanity. And Europe was almost destroyed. But it was the ideas of Dante and what he represented, the ideas of Abelard of Paris, again a victim. These ideas gave us the foundations of a modern European civilization founded in the period of the Council of Florence in the 15th century. These were the ideas of Socrates, and the ideas of Plato above all others. The idea of Christianity, which was not that of the Vatican of that time, but was that of Plato, of the followers of Plato, as Paul's 1 Corinthians 13 attests, the concept of agape. So it was in the history of mankind. It was the struggle for truth against populism, against what we call in the United States today democracy, or public opinion, or official opinion of the news media. It was those who fought against that, who fought for truth, who made history. Some of them didn't make it much in their own lifetime, except to get persecution. But they made it for the future. Now, this comes to the question of how do you assess your life? Do you assess your life as death and birth as bookends, and you exist only between the bookends? And therefore, you have to be pleasant reading between the bookends. Each page must be pleasure and comfort and satisfaction. And don't worry about the future. There'll be so much pleasure, you won't notice you're passing. Or, knowing that this is the nature of man, that you are born and going to die sooner or later, isn't it how you spend your life and to what effect for humanity that counts? All of the effective people in history were people who did that. They made that choice. They had a conception of birth and death as sort of the bookends of mortality. But they also saw in themselves something which is more than mortality. The ability to discover truth, to discover principles of the universe, to introduce these to humanity, to pass them on to humanity, to be used by present or by future generations for the benefit of mankind. In the sense that you live in creating the future of mankind. You live in bringing forth from the past. You correct the injustices of the past. Truth was fought for in the past by civilizations that were crushed, by people that were crushed. When you do something to bring justice to the dead, even thousands of years later, you are doing something that makes your life important. Because you're not only bringing justice to them, you're preserving and putting into perspective the importance of what they did for tomorrow, as we do with these studies of Platonic studies and other studies. We're trying to find the most ancient expressions of humanity. We're looking for contributions of tens of thousands of years ago and longer, which have permanent value for humanity, which we should understand today, assimilate, and see what we can do with them, see what we learn from that, and see what we can contribute from this to a better understanding of mankind's future. These are the kinds of things that we have to do. If we are those kinds of people, if we are secure in our sense of personal identity, that we are people living in the present who do honor to the past and to provide for the future, then what do we have to fear? They kill us, we're going to die anyway. What have they taken away from us? Except the opportunity to do good. So therefore, our job and your job, the only way you can find the strength inside yourself to do what you have to do, is to locate your identity accordingly as an historic individual, a person who is serving to bring justice out of the past, out of the contributions of people past, and working to build a heritage on which the future of humanity can prosper. You know, it's like the case of Martin when he was his last speech the day before they came to kill him. What was he fighting for? Was he fighting for civil rights for so-called African Americans? No, he wasn't doing that. He had a higher mission: to make the nation right for everyone. And his power was that he was not a single issue idiot. He was a leader of the entire nation, trying to bring the nation to an understanding of what was right. And we who come from the lowest shall reach the highest, because we are making a great contribution to this nation and to all humanity by bringing the United States to what it was intended to become. That is a sense of immortality. It's a sense also of truthfulness, because you cannot believe that you are actually earning, a sense, immortality for living now, unless you can believe that what you're doing is truthful. It corresponds to the laws of the universe. It corresponds to principles of verifiable truth. You cannot assert an opinion because you choose to believe it and fight for that opinion because you feel you should fight for that opinion. That's not worth anything. You have to know with absolute certainty that what you're doing is right. And therefore, the first thing you have to deal with is, do you know what is right? Huh? So therefore, the importance of, I've stressed on Gauss, on this 1799 paper, which is absolutely unique. You won't find the same thing directly expressed in any later paper of Gauss, but only in that paper, the first one he ever published, as a scientific paper, in which he attacked Euler, Lagrange, de Mandeville, and so forth. D'Alembert. He attacked them on what? He attacked them on what issue? The issue was the nature of man. It was a concept that he had acquired partly under the influence of two of his teachers, Kästner and Zimmermann. He had this concept of an anti-Euclidean geometry from them. Throw away the axioms, definitions, and postulates of an a priori or idealistic notion of geometry. Limit yourself to what you know are universal physical principles. That is, principles which lie beyond sense perception, but which affect sense perception, and by the Socratic method of hypothesis, you can discover what these principles are that you cannot detect directly with your senses, but principles which affect what you see with your senses. Principles, universal principles. No principles must guide you or govern your mind except what you know to be universal in that sense. Don't say, well, my experience teaches me. Huh? Say, don't be an idiot. Your experience never taught you anything. Look, I got a goat out there. The goat has got a lot of experience. That goat is doing the same damn thing his grandfather is doing, if he gets a chance. He's learned from experience. You can vote for Bush by experience. I did it before, I'll do it again. Without considering what actually, how the universe is going to react to this phenomenon you're voting for Bush. So therefore, you have to know that the principle is actually valid in terms of beyond the senses, which means with only the human mind can discover a universal principle. Only a human mind can take and seek out the paradoxes, the inconsistencies, the errors in experience, and find a pattern in these errors, and define what the universe must be like to cause this to occur. And then to test that principle that you think you have, the solution you have, and test it by applying it to demonstrate or test whether that principle is true or not. And that's what you know. And you have two areas to work in. The reason I proposed the Gauss 1799 paper was because it poses this question, what Euler, Lagrange, and others denied. They denied the existence of principles existing beyond their perception by sense perception. That is, the principles could not be perceived by sense perception, but could only be adduced by the method of hypothesis by proving experimentally a discovery of a principle which lies and operates from outside sense perception. So that what you have in sense perception is essentially the shadow cast by a principle upon the domain of sense perception. Sense perception is like a screen. And what you know is the shadows that real principles cast upon the screen, the projection screen of sense perception. Only a human being can do that. That is unique. That's the first thing you have to learn. And the first thing you apply it where? You apply it to physical experiments that you, with your mind, can directly observe. How does nature behave? You try to find the principles that run nature. You look, as we do generally, you look at abiotic principles, non-living processes. You conduct experiments which are based on the assumption the processes are non-living. Then you have a second class of experiments, of physical experiments, which deals with so-called living processes. And you're concerned about the principal distinction primarily between those classes of experiments which correspond to non-living processes and those classes of experiments which involve another principle, an additional principle, which is not found in non-living processes. And you look as Vanowski did at the planet. And the planet is a biosphere. What does that mean? That life is more powerful than abiotic principles. That life penetrates and acts upon the domain of abiotic principles. Life does not come from inorganic processes. Life is a principle in the universe which acts upon what we call inorganic processes to produce the combined effect such as we call a biosphere. A planet which has fossil layers and so forth, including the atmosphere, which is a fossil, a product of living activities, which produce the atmosphere, which produce the oceans, the water, which produce the fossil layers on this planet, which concentrated certain minerals and certain deposits within the fossil layer, which you will not find concentrated sufficiently for your purpose anywhere else, except by knowing which fossil made that deposit. Who made all that chalk on the cliffs of Dover? Trillions of animals who died and left their little bodies behind as chalk as a result of what they had consumed. Right? So the planet is becoming more and more a living creature because what we call the inorganic or abiotic processes of the planet are constantly being gobbled up and taken over by a superior force called life. And then we find a third one. The planet is being transformed, the biosphere is being transformed by a more powerful force. The more powerful force is the ability of the human mind to discover a universal physical principle. And the changes in the planet as a whole, as a result of man's discovery and application of physical principles, is changing the planet into what Vanowski called a noosphere. That is, the ratio of the total pure weight of the mass of the planet is being increased, so the products of man's intervention through man's discovery of principles is becoming more and more. And if this continues, the whole solar system is going to become a product of the human mind, which has gobbled up, assimilated, and mastered all processes of non-living and living processes in the planet. That's the process. Nice, huh? This is what's known as being creative. This is what is known as man in the image of the Creator, a power which exists only because of the powers unique to the human mind of forming a valid hypothesis and verifying that hypothesis by experimental methods of an appropriate type. That's number one. That's one department of knowledge. And that's what Gauss refers to. There is no truthful mathematics unless it takes into account the existence of phenomena, objects, which are not phenomena of the senses, but phenomena of the mind, called verified universal physical principles. And therefore, when you write a mathematical formula, as was later made clear by Dirichlet, a teacher of Riemann's, and Riemann himself, the concept of the complex domain. What do you mean by the complex domain? It means, on the one hand, your calculations at the blackboard, so to speak, must reflect, first of all, what you actually observe with your senses, or observe with an instrument which functions as an extension of your senses. But that is not what explains the universe. That is not the universe. You must now say that there's also something else in there, which is not accounted for by these so-called sense-perceptual constructions. It comes like a shadow. It's like the loop in the orbit of Mars, which comes periodically, where Mars appears to go backward upon itself in its orbit and then come back into the regular orbit. An anomaly, not explained by any of the usual nonsense. So therefore, what is this anomaly, or any other anomaly? It's the shadow of the hand of the real universe. Concept of principles reflected as a deformation, a distortion, a modification, of what the senses see directly and explicitly. What do you call that? Well, you say, let's take the complex domain. And you introduce the concept of the complex domain, which casts shadows upon the perceptual domain. That's the complex domain. And what Gauss is saying clearly in the question of the fundamental theorem of algebra at that point is exactly that. It is a fraud by Euler, by Lagrange, and the other haters of Leibniz to insist that mathematics can work on the basis of a Cartesian or Euclidean model of mathematics. Because that model is the model of the universe as seen by animals, not by human beings. The human mind sees the universe as principles acting upon the universe, distort the shadows of sense perception, impose something upon sense perception which is not consistent with a sense perceptual view of the universe. That's number one. That's the principle of truth. And that's what Euler and Lagrange reject. They reject the notion of truth because they reject the idea that we must discover the universal physical principles which actually govern the universe, principles which we cannot directly determine through the senses by extrapolation from sense perception, but which we must account for as distortions of a sense perceptual universe caused by these principles. It is this kind of knowledge by man applied to the universe which creates the noosphere, an idea which already existed among ancient Greeks, the idea of nous, the idea of the power of the human mind, a creative power of mind to discover the principles of the universe and to, with that discovery, apply these principles of the universe to the universe as an act of man's will to change the order of the universe. This is the concept of creativity. It is not new to Vernadsky with the concept of the noosphere. On the contrary, Vernadsky proceeded on the basis of classical Greek precedent on this account. And he proceeded on the basis of recognizing that the kind of universe that he knew from the standpoint of his biogeochemistry as the noosphere was a reflection of the power of the human mind becoming manifest as transforming the universe entirely into something dominated entirely by the human mind and the acts of the human mind. So if you discover that principle, now you've got another problem, which you can also observe, the behavior of people. Now this is almost a form of disease, and you have to have a clinical attitude about the whole business. Otherwise, you don't understand people. If you don't look at people as a disease, you can't understand them. Because their behavior is absurd. But nonetheless, despite the absurdity, which is prevalent in our time, is one of our greatest contributions, we have proceeded further and more into higher levels in absurdity than has been known in mankind before this time. That is the achievement of our age. But we also observe that despite this, you see, for example, take the case in history, where I referred to it often. Now, the Roman Empire was an abomination before it came into existence. It came into existence because it was already an abomination. And it was an abomination produced by an abomination. And Roman law, Roman tradition, it's evil. It should never have happened, but it did. Then you have, in Roman culture, you had the case, for example, of Cicero. And Cicero was a positive figure who was killed in the course of the death of time of the civil wars and the death of Julius Caesar, the assassination of Caesar. Soon after that, Caesar's great enemy, Cicero, was murdered. But so you see that. Then you go into another period of evil, from about the 9th century AD into the Dark Age. This is an age of evil. This was the age of ultramontanism, where the Christian church from the top became corrupt, rotten, and evil. How? Well, they adopted a policy from the Roman Empire, policy which they used to call the donation of Constantine, which is a fraud. It never happened. But it was created as a myth, as a piece of fiction, to try to control the church and control the Christians. The argument was that the Pope had divine authority, given to him as a power by the Emperor Constantine. This pig. Now, pigs do not give divine powers. They may give a lot of pork, but not willingly. So this thing was actually a creation in the decline of the power of Byzantium. A bunch of swine living at the north of the Adriatic Sea, in an area which was emerging as Venice, which was an area of pirates and moneylenders, usurers, which formed a society based on Roman law, the general law of the family of Roman society. Of a large family would appoint a leader of that family, who was a leader in various predatory operations such as usury, but generally thievery of that type, loan shark type of thievery. And so this system took over the power in Europe. It took over, it began to chew up Byzantium. It became a maritime power and a rentier, financier, oligarchical power. It exerted its power as the bankers of Europe from Venice through an alliance with a bunch of criminals called the Normans, which became known as Norman chivalry. They made an alliance with certain forces controlling the papacy, which were also allied to them, including the Cluniacs from the Benedictine area of Cluny. And they set up a system with the Ultramontane system. This was characterized by the Crusades. And the Crusades began, of course, with the Albigensian Crusade, and then actually the Norman conquest of England, killing all the Christians, who were called Anglo-Saxons at the time. I don't think England has fully recovered from the extermination of Christians by the Normans to the present day. So this Norman system, the system of the Crusades, Norman chivalry, the blessings of Cluny, the control of the papacy by Cluny largely, and the control of all of this by Venice, which was financing the Crusades and taking in the loot as the loan shark. The loan shark sent the chivalry out to kill and rape. The chivalry came back and deposited their loot with the bankers. The bankers were the loan sharks. The loan sharks, the bankers, were Venice. That was the system. This system ended up as creating the New Dark Age of the 14th century. Now, in this period of darkness, you have some beautiful things were done. The Cathedral of Chartres, for example, in France, is an example of a great work of art and a principle of cathedral building, which typifies a great culture is struggling to emerge under the domination of this evil empire, this so-called ultramontane system, that no government should exist except the government of this imperial authority. And the Pope was supposed to be the stooge for the imperial authority. And that's the way they ran things. But even in this evil age, the beauty of mankind, the beauty of the human mind, asserted itself against tyranny with contributions from which we benefit today. Among those were the contributions of one of the greatest minds of that period, Dante Alighieri, whose work was the foundation of the idea of modern art, modern poetry, modern drama, in its modern form, come essentially out of the work of Dante Alighieri, the ideas of statecraft. So this requires us to look at the second area apart from so-called physical effects. Apart from the simple physical effects, you look at another object which is anomalous, and this is frightening, the human mind. Now you look at the behavior of the human mind, and you look at it from one standpoint in particular. You don't start with the individual human mind, though you're going back to the individual human mind. You look at social relations and social processes. And you say, how is it possible that individuals who make individual discoveries of universal physical principles, how is it possible that they're able to agree to cooperate in using those principles and applying them to make society better? How does man learn how to behave with respect to man on the basis of recognizing that there's something about a human being that's different than an animal? The human being is capable of discovering through hypothesis and through experiment universal principles which are true. They're true in man's relationship to nature. They're true in man's relationship to inorganic nature and organic nature. Now, what is true in terms of principle in the behavior by mankind himself or among people? Where's the lawfulness in that? Is this subject to laws of principle as living processes are or non-living ones? Are there universal principles of human behavior which are truly universal? This becomes then the study of what? How do you go at this? You study history. You study history not as it's taught usually. You study history as sometimes people learn it by institutions which don't intend to do that. They tell you tradition. They give you explanations of how mankind went from one generation to another. But look at mankind from a much more interesting standpoint. Mankind's power over nature comes from an increase in the accumulation of and application of discoveries of universal physical principles, as the Socratic method defines that, as Plato defines it. By these principles, man acquires what the classical Greek, that is the pre-Aristotle, pre-Euclid classical Greeks defined as powers. And this is the most important thing for you to know. The concept of powers. It has one which is that seems to be deceptively simple. Another is not so simple. It's much more fun because it changes the way you define yourself. Once you begin to understand this principle, which is denied to you in virtually every university that you ever attend, once you understand that, you have to change. Your conception of yourself has to change. And your effectiveness as a person has to change for the better. All right, start with the simplest aspect of it. When we discover a universal physical principle, if we are able to cooperate in using that principle, we are able, therefore, to increase man's power in the universe as measurable per capita and measurable per square kilometer of surface area of the Earth. It's expressed as partly as technologies which come as a product of the discovery of these principles. Man now has more power. The individual has more willpower to change nature and change its behavior, to lift mankind to a higher standard of living, to make possible more people to live. Because if we were simply what we appear to be, we are a variety of great apes, and not so great at that. Under those conditions, taking the past 2 million years of our estimation of what the ecology of this planet has looked like during the ice ages, mankind's population could not have exceeded somewhere between a single-digit million living individuals. We now have over 6 billion people living on this planet. How did that happen? Obviously, mankind did something that no monkey could do, no gorilla could do, and George Bush couldn't do either. He may qualify as an ape, or he's aping the wrong people. We can increase the power of mankind per capita to exist in the universe. This is one of the most important things. We, mankind, by discovering and applying universal principles, can increase man's power in and over the universe. The principles already existed. They existed in the universe. But once we discover them, rather than being merely affected by them, they now become subjects of our will. And that's the point I want to make to you. Will, your will. What is the meaning of will? Willpower. Because you are not now discovering a rule by which you act. Oh, some people do that. They go to school, they just study textbooks, they rehearse things, experiments. They learn the rules. They hear about energy, which doesn't exist. Energy is an effect, it's not a substance. They learn the rules. Now, if we obey these rules, and maybe with a little bit of cheating to help out, we can make something of this. That's what you get. You try to enforce the rules. So now you are a subject of the rules. You go to a university to become a subject of the rules. The way you punctuate is not the way you think, it's the way you were taught to behave. And most of the way you punctuate is idiotic. You cannot communicate ideas the way most of you punctuate. At least you couldn't communicate them clearly. You hear some people speaking as if they were a teletype machine gone amok. There's no punctuation in their speech. Typical television radio announcer today. Nothing to there. There's no expression. There's no division of subject. The idea of subject with relationship to subject doesn't exist. Contrast, irony doesn't exist. The function of irony is denied. We become dolts, and I know I have to deal with a lot of them. Right? So, therefore, the question is, do you simply learn to obey the rules which you call principles as described in mathematical or similar terms from lectures, educational programs, rehearsals? Or do you actually have the will, the efficient will, to change the universe? This is where I get into trouble, because I do have this will. The typical, for example, in Kepler, when Kepler's translated works, his conception of universal physical principle, of the type that Gauss is referring to in attacking Euler and Lagrange and so forth, he uses the concept of intention. He says that the law of the universe, a physical law of the universe, reflects the Creator's intention. In other words, the universe is no longer a machine, a clockwork machine which is ticking along to fix laws. The universe is now seen as some intellectual force. An efficient intellectual force is moving the universe in a way we recognize as universal physical laws, as distinct from mechanical or clockwork types of laws. So Kepler says this is the intention of the Creator. The concept of gravity is the intention of the Creator. It is not a principle like a clockwork design applied to the universe. It is an efficient intention by an intellectual power. Now, when you generate a discovery or regenerate the experience of making the discovery, your relationship to the universe is far different than the adult who passed the examination in the university, than the engineer who looks up with his slide rule and or whatever, his computer, and looks up tables or looks up formulas. This guy is adult. He is not a person of will and intention, except for perhaps other things, but not for science. The will comes in this way. You have to think about the process by which a discovery occurs. And don't look at a discovery as a shadow, an effect of something that happened. You have to account for the way this act of discovery came into being. Now, I had the pleasure of addressing a building trades council meeting in Louisville, Kentucky, the day before yesterday. And I went through this with them, and I'll just give you a summation. You'll see it in the briefing probably tomorrow or the next day. I said, I am a troublemaker. And you know that every job you go on is usually bad. And your job is to make a bad job, which you are given to do, a good job. Because every job is defined incompetently in one degree or another. What you have to do is recognize, of course, that the incompetence of the assignment you've been given. And then you have to discover what the problem is, what the trouble is. So you are looking for trouble. You concentrate on looking for trouble. You expect it. You demand it. Because you know that this thing that is not going to work involves assumptions which are false. You have to find out how these ideas, these false ideas came into being. And you've got to discover the nature of the problem, and you've got to develop a solution for the problem within the practical terms in which you're operating. That is what a typical engineer or building trades team is doing. They're given a job. Here's a blueprint. Do it. God, this thing will never work. What's wrong with it? Why doesn't it work? What's wrong with the design? We've got to fix it. We've got the job of doing this job. If we do it as we're told, it's going to be a monster. It'll fail. Therefore, we have to concentrate and think, what is wrong with this? What is the trouble with it? And therefore, we have to turn a bad job, which we're given to do, into a good job to get the result intended. Now, what this means is the person who does that is a different kind of person than the usual punk coming out of universities. They are looking for trouble. They become good students because they're looking for trouble. They're given, this is what you will do. Another flop. I've got to find out what's wrong with this creature that's telling me this. I've got to find out what the truth is. Don't swallow it because you're taught. I recall years ago, my parents and others would tell me to do something, I never do it. They'd say, you wait till you're grown up and wait until you have your degrees, and then you can criticize. Until then, learn what you're told to learn. Pass the examination and read the books and repeat after me. Now, a good scientist never did that. A good scientist is a rebel. This guy's telling me something. He said, do it this way. Now I'm going to prove this bum is wrong. I'm going to find out what the trouble is with the way he's thinking. Not what he's thinking, but the way he's thinking. So therefore, your intention is not simply operating with a certain formula as a principle, to discover the formula by looking it up in the book. Look in the internet. It must be there someplace. And then apply it. That is not really human. We are getting more and more to the point we can get computers to do that. What do we need that guy for? We need human beings for their human potential, not for their machine-like potential. The point is you have to be the kind of person who is looking for trouble. You're looking for the bad job that's presented to you, and you're trying to make a good job out of the bad job you're asked to do. And you have an attitude of always looking for the error, the falseness in the assumptions given to you. You develop the ability to smell out those errors as typified by the Gauss 1799 paper. Wherever you find somebody arguing the way Euler did, the way Lagrange did, the way Cauchy did, whenever you find someone thinking like that, you know you've got a mental case on your hands. This guy does not belong to this universe. Therefore, now what you have to do is recognize you've got trouble. There's something wrong here. Now, what is the practical implication of the fallacy of Cauchy, the fallacy of Euler? Why is Newton an idiot? Prove it. Be a troublemaker. Prove it. Now, this is a way of thinking. It's a natural human way of thinking, as opposed from learning how to behave. Being a troublemaker, you have the intention. You are copying what Kepler recognized in the universe, what Plato and Pythagoras recognized in the universe, that when mankind makes a discovery of principle, a natural principle, mankind has acquired a new power from the Creator over the universe. And this power changes man's relationship to the universe. But the essential thing is not the discovery of this result. The essential thing is the passion, the sense of intention which drives you to make those discoveries and to act upon them. In other words, it's not applying the right formula to the situation that creates a scientist, not least a good scientist. What creates the good scientist is that he is intrinsically a troublemaker. He knows the society is a lot of fraud. And therefore, he is always looking for what is wrong and trying to develop in himself or herself a mental map of the kinds of mistakes that are made by the society now. And therefore, whenever you run into a situation where you find typical behavior of the type of a class of type that you know is wrong, you go by instinct, or as if by instinct, to change it. And the one thing you want to do is change it, because you know that the act you perform today may be necessary, but the human action is what you do to change the universe by developing new powers. And how? Every time you face a challenge which you know epistemologically to be wrong, you are going to try to find the answer, the solution. When you try to find the solution, you're going to be determined that it be implemented. That's your intention. You're now acting like God. You're now acting in the likeness of the Creator. You are a troublemaker, like the Creator. And that's George Bush doesn't like that very much. Anyway, so that's the point. The point of the matter is you're in a situation, you're young, you're adults, therefore you have this potential. You have more energy than the old, dried out, old husks who your parents are, the under 62ers, the disaster area. You have that. Therefore, you have the energy and the flexibility to be able to be persons of intention, to be persons of will, to express will in this sense, not as the idea of a formula, but as a commitment to discover what is wrong, to be able to develop in yourself the ability to recognize symptoms of where wrong thinking is coming out. Like the great military commander who succeeds because he outflanks the opponent. He recognizes a principle they didn't recognize and uses it as an act of will to win the battle or the war. What I'm doing, in a sense, with this election campaign, I'm outflanking the bastards. They say, well, if you don't win that primary, how are you going to win? Don't worry, buddy. Wait till we come to Moscow, and you'll see how Napoleon fares. Yeah? That's what happened to Napoleon. He got to Moscow, and that was the end of him, or the beginning of the end. And that was a plan. It was an intention founded actually in the discoveries of Friedrich Schiller, in studies of the Netherlands War and the 30 Years' War. And his cousin-in-law, von Wolzogen, made the study based on Schiller's studies, presented it to the Prussian General Staff, which is advising Tsar Alexander I. And the choice was made: do not try to beat Napoleon and his Grande Armée at the borders. Don't spend your troops trying to defeat him at the borders. Draw him in by retreating. If he goes toward Petrograd, retreat toward Petrograd. If he goes toward Moscow, God save him. We'll get him there. Moscow was mined. The battles were drawn out to make sure that it took time for Napoleon to get to Moscow. By the time he got there, it was winter. And the city was mined. Napoleon's troops celebrated their occupation of the city, and the city blew up. Napoleon, without logistics, had to retreat. And the Russian army, with its Prussian volunteers in it, fell upon the heels of Napoleon. Large sections of the Russian population mobilized as guerrilla fighters against Napoleon. And Napoleon reached Poland first, long before the rear guard, headed by Marshal Ney, came in. Marshal Ney came in the winter. Napoleon greeted him and said, "Where are your troops?" Marshal Ney looked at him forlorn. "I am your troops. I am your rear guard." In the history of battles, in the history of struggles, that is often the way it goes. You don't say, if you're going to win, these are the rules by which you win. The minute the enemy presents you and says, these are the rules which you have to play by, the rules by which you will be scored, smile. You got the sucker. Thank you.